Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to day 2 of our exploration into the fascinating tapestry of early American history. Today, we embark on a journey through one of the most transformative periods in global history, the Age of Discovery. This era, stretching from the late 15th to the early 17th centuries, was marked by a surge of maritime exploration that not only expanded the boundaries of the known world, but also redefined the nature of global interactions. The Age of Discovery, often referred to as the Age of Exploration, was characterized by European nations embarking on bold voyages across uncharted oceans. Motivated by a mix of economic ambitions, quest for knowledge, and religious zeal, these explorations set in motion a series of events that would irrevocably alter the course of history. The explorers of this period were driven by the promise of new trade routes, the allure of untapped resources, and a desire to spread their cultural and religious values across the globe. Key figures in this era include Vasco da Gama, Christopher Columbus, and Ferdinand Magellan, each of whom played a pivotal role in expanding European horizons. Vasco da Gama's journey around the Cape of Good Hope to reach India opened a direct maritime route between Europe and Asia, revolutionizing trade in spices and other valuable commodities. Christopher Columbus, in his 1492 voyage, famously crossed the Atlantic and reached the Caribbean, an expedition that would be among the most consequential in history, as it initiated sustained contact between Europe and the Americas. Ferdinand Magellan's expedition, though Magellan himself did not survive to complete it, was the first to circumnavigate the globe, demonstrating the vastness of the Earth and the interconnectedness of its oceans. These explorers, and many others like them, were not merely charting unknown territories. They were setting the stage for unprecedented global interactions. Their voyages led to the establishment of new trade routes, the exchange of goods and ideas, and the beginning of a process that would fundamentally alter the demographic and cultural landscapes of both the Old and New Worlds. As we delve into this transformative period, it is crucial to understand the multifaceted motivations behind these explorations. European nations were driven by a combination of economic interests, seeking new trade routes to access valuable resources such as spices, gold, and silver, and a profound sense of curiosity and adventure. Additionally, there was a religious component, with many explorers motivated by the desire to spread Christianity to what they considered new lands. This blend of economic, exploratory, and religious motivations created a potent mix that fueled an era of remarkable discovery and expansion. However, it is also important to recognize that these explorations were not without profound consequences. The Age of Discovery was marked by the encounters between European explorers and indigenous peoples, which were often fraught with complexity and conflict. These interactions were a crucial aspect of the era and had far-reaching impacts on the indigenous populations of the Americas. The arrival of Europeans brought not only new technologies and ideas, but also devastating diseases, leading to significant demographic and societal changes among indigenous communities. In our exploration today, we will focus on the key themes of the Age of Discovery, including the motivations behind European exploration, the significant voyages and discoveries made during this period, and the initial encounters between Europeans and indigenous peoples. By examining these elements, we will gain a deeper understanding of how this era set the stage for the dramatic shifts that would follow in the centuries to come. As we proceed, keep in mind that the Age of Discovery was not a monolithic or singular experience, but a complex and multifaceted period that involved diverse experiences and outcomes. From the high seas to distant lands, the explorers of this era were navigating not only physical distances, but also cultural and ideological frontiers. Thank you for joining me today as we embark on this journey through the Age of Discovery. We will explore how these voyages redefined global exploration, the impact of these encounters on indigenous societies, and the early colonization efforts that followed. Together, we will uncover the intricate dynamics of this transformative period and appreciate its lasting legacy in shaping the modern world. The Age of Discovery, an era of exploration. The Age of Discovery, which spanned from the late 15th to the early 17th centuries, stands as a landmark period in the history of global exploration. This era, often called the Age of Exploration, was marked by unprecedented maritime ventures that reshaped the world map and set the stage for future global interactions. At its core, the Age of Discovery was driven by a combination of economic aspirations, technological advancements, and a quest for knowledge. Economic motivations. Economic factors played a crucial role in propelling the Age of Discovery. European nations, particularly Spain and Portugal, were motivated by the pursuit of new trade routes and resources. The quest for wealth was a powerful catalyst for exploration. Spices, silk, precious metals, and other valuable commodities were in high demand in Europe, and the established overland trade routes were fraught with difficulty and cost. The idea of finding a direct maritime route to Asia, bypassing the intermediary traders of the Middle East and North Africa, was especially enticing. Portugal, under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, was a key player in this quest. Henry's sponsorship of voyages along the west coast of Africa aimed to discover new routes and establish direct trade with the rich markets of Asia. This initiative not only led to the discovery of new territories, but also played a significant role in the development of navigational techniques and maritime technology. Technological advancements. Technological advancements were integral to the successes of the Age of Discovery. Innovations in shipbuilding, such as the development of the caravel, a small, highly maneuverable ship, enabled longer voyages and more effective exploration. The caravel's design, with its lateen sails, allowed it to sail more effectively against the wind, which was crucial for navigating the Atlantic Ocean and the coastlines of Africa and the Americas. Navigational tools also saw significant improvements during this period. The astrolabe, used to measure the altitude of celestial bodies, and the compass, which provided a reliable sense of direction, were essential for oceanic navigation. These advancements not only increased the range and safety of voyages, but also allowed explorers to venture further from the coastlines and into uncharted waters. Key figures and voyages. Several key figures emerged during this era, each contributing to the expansion of European horizons. Vasco da Gama's voyage around the Cape of Good Hope to reach India was a landmark achievement. By establishing a sea route to Asia, da Gama opened the door for a new era of global trade. His successful journey paved the way for Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean trade network, which would have lasting economic and political implications. Christopher Columbus's voyages are perhaps the most famous of the Age of Discovery. In 1492, Columbus set sail with the intention of reaching Asia by crossing the Atlantic. Instead, he arrived in the Caribbean, making contact with the indigenous peoples of the Americas. While Columbus's voyages were initially intended to find a new route to Asia, they marked the beginning of sustained European exploration and colonization of the New World. Columbus's expeditions had profound consequences, initiating an era of European expansion that would lead to widespread exploration and eventual colonization of the Americas. Ferdinand Magellan's expedition, although Magellan himself did not live to complete it, was the first to circumnavigate the globe. This journey demonstrated the vastness of the Earth and the interconnectedness of its oceans, providing a new understanding of the world's geography and confirming that the Earth could be circumnavigated by sea. The broader impact. The Age of Discovery was not merely a period of geographic exploration but also a time of significant cultural and economic exchange. The discoveries made during this era set in motion a process of global interconnectedness that would have profound implications for the centuries that followed. The opening of new trade routes, the exchange of goods and ideas, and the expansion of European influence laid the groundwork for the modern global economy. However, it is essential to recognize that this era was also marked by conflict and exploitation. The encounters between European explorers and indigenous peoples were often marked by violence, cultural imposition, and significant demographic changes. The impact of these interactions, including the devastating spread of diseases and the imposition of European political and economic systems, had far-reaching consequences for indigenous societies. In summary, the Age of Discovery was a transformative period characterized by bold maritime exploration driven by economic motivations, technological advancements, and the pursuit of knowledge. The voyages undertaken during this era not only expanded the geographic understanding of the world, but also set the stage for complex global interactions and exchanges that would shape the course of history. As we continue our exploration of this period, we will delve into the specific interactions between European explorers and indigenous peoples, examining the far-reaching effects of these encounters and their lasting impact on the world. The Columbian Exchange, a global transformation. The Columbian Exchange, a term coined by the historian Alfred W. Crosby in 1972, refers to the vast and complex exchange of goods, ideas, people, and diseases between the Old World, Europe, Africa, and Asia, and the New World, the Americas, that began with Christopher Columbus's voyages in 1492. This exchange had profound and far-reaching consequences for both hemispheres, fundamentally altering ecosystems, economies, and societies. Exchange of plants and animals. One of the most significant aspects of the Columbian Exchange was the transfer of plants and animals between the Old World and the New World. Before the arrival of Europeans, the Americas had a unique and diverse array of flora and fauna. Similarly, the Old World was home to its own distinct species. The Columbian Exchange brought these two worlds into contact, leading to the introduction of new crops and livestock that would have lasting impacts on global agriculture and diets. In the Americas, European explorers and settlers introduced a variety of crops and animals. Wheat, barley, oats, and sugarcane became staple crops in the New World, while domesticated animals such as horses, cattle, sheep, and pigs were introduced. The introduction of horses, in particular, had a transformative effect on many indigenous cultures, revolutionizing transportation, hunting, and warfare. Conversely, the Americas contributed several important crops to the Old World. Maize, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and beans were among the most notable. Potatoes, for example, became a staple food in Europe, particularly in Ireland and Russia, due to their high yield and nutritional value. Maize and tomatoes also became integral to European diets and cuisines. Exchange of technologies and ideas. The Columbian Exchange was not limited to biological exchanges. It also involved the transfer of technologies and ideas. European technologies such as metal tools, firearms, and the wheel were introduced to the Americas, significantly impacting indigenous societies. These technologies often disrupted traditional ways of life and altered power dynamics. On the other hand, indigenous peoples introduced Europeans to new agricultural techniques and crop varieties that were well-suited to the American environment. For example, the cultivation of maize and potatoes in Europe required new farming methods adapted to these crops' unique needs. Introduction of diseases. One of the most devastating aspects of the Columbian Exchange was the introduction of diseases. European explorers and settlers brought with them diseases such as smallpox, influenza, and measles, to which indigenous populations had no immunity. The impact of these diseases was catastrophic, leading to widespread epidemics and significant population declines among indigenous peoples. Smallpox, in particular, had a profound effect. It is estimated that in some regions, indigenous populations experienced mortality rates as high as 90% due to smallpox outbreaks. These diseases not only caused immense human suffering but also had long-term social and cultural consequences for indigenous societies. Impact on indigenous societies. The Columbian Exchange had a transformative impact on indigenous societies. The introduction of new crops and animals altered traditional agricultural practices and diets. While some of these changes were beneficial, such as increased food variety and production, others had negative effects. The introduction of European livestock, for instance, led to overgrazing and environmental changes in certain areas. The exchange also led to significant cultural and societal shifts. The spread of European technologies and goods altered traditional ways of life, often leading to cultural disintegration and conflict. Additionally, the arrival of Europeans and their accompanying technologies had significant impacts on power dynamics, leading to shifts in indigenous political and social structures. Long-term consequences. The Columbian Exchange had long-lasting consequences that extended beyond the immediate aftermath of the Age of Discovery. The global movement of plants, animals, and diseases set the stage for a new era of interconnectedness and cultural exchange. It laid the groundwork for the modern global economy as new trade networks and agricultural practices developed. The exchange also had enduring impacts on global demographics and ecosystems. The introduction of non-native species to new environments led to ecological changes, including the displacement of native species and alterations in land use. These changes continue to shape ecosystems and agricultural practices today. In summary, the Columbian Exchange was a pivotal event in world history that reshaped global landscapes, economies, and societies. The introduction of new plants, animals, technologies, and diseases had profound and far-reaching effects, creating a complex web of interactions that continues to influence the modern world. Understanding the Columbian Exchange provides valuable insights into the interconnectedness of global history and the enduring impacts of early encounters between the Old World and the New World. Impact of European diseases on indigenous populations. The introduction of European diseases to the Americas was one of the most catastrophic and transformative aspects of the Columbian Exchange. European explorers and settlers carried with them diseases to which indigenous populations had no immunity, leading to widespread and devastating epidemics. The impact of these diseases reshaped the demographic, social, and cultural landscapes of the Americas in profound ways. Disease transmission and immunity. European diseases such as smallpox, influenza, measles, typhus, and whooping cough were unknown to the indigenous peoples of the Americas before the arrival of Europeans. These diseases were highly infectious and spread rapidly through indigenous populations who had no prior exposure or immunity to them. The absence of immunity meant that these diseases could have particularly severe effects, with indigenous communities experiencing high mortality rates. Smallpox, in particular, was the most lethal of the diseases introduced. It caused widespread outbreaks that decimated indigenous populations. Smallpox lesions, fever, and complications led to high death rates, and the disease's rapid spread was exacerbated by the dense populations in some indigenous societies. Estimates suggest that smallpox alone may have caused the deaths of millions of indigenous people in the decades following European contact. Epidemics and population decline. The epidemics caused by European diseases led to dramatic declines in indigenous populations. In many areas, entire communities were wiped out or severely reduced in number. For instance, the Aztec Empire, which had a population of approximately 25 million at the time of European contact, experienced a catastrophic decline due to smallpox and other diseases. It is estimated that by the early 16th century, the indigenous population had decreased by up to 90% in some regions. Similarly, the Inca Empire, which had a population of around 10 million, faced a significant decline due to the impact of European diseases. The spread of diseases such as smallpox and influenza contributed to the weakening of indigenous societies, making them more vulnerable to conquest and colonization. Social and cultural impact. The demographic collapse caused by disease had profound social and cultural impacts on indigenous societies. The loss of large portions of the population disrupted social structures, including family units, leadership roles, and community organization. The death of key leaders and knowledgeable individuals further exacerbated the breakdown of traditional societal structures. Cultural practices and traditions were also affected by the population decline. Many indigenous rituals, ceremonies, and cultural practices were lost or significantly altered due to the reduced number of practitioners. The disruption of traditional ways of life and the imposition of European systems further contributed to the erosion of indigenous cultural identities. Long-term effects. The long-term effects of disease on indigenous populations extended beyond the immediate aftermath of the epidemics. The demographic collapse created power vacuums and social upheavals that affected indigenous resistance to European colonization. Weakened by disease, many indigenous societies struggled to mount effective resistance against European encroachment and colonization efforts. The introduction of European diseases also had lasting implications for the development of the Americas. The resulting population declines and social disruptions facilitated European colonization and exploitation of the New World. The loss of indigenous labor and resistance made it easier for European powers to establish and expand their colonies. Ongoing implications. The legacy of the disease epidemics introduced during the Age of Discovery continues to influence the historical memory and cultural narratives of indigenous peoples. The devastating impact of these diseases is remembered as a significant factor in the history of European colonization and its effects on indigenous populations. The consequences of these epidemics remain a crucial aspect of understanding the broader historical context of European expansion and its lasting impacts on the Americas. In summary, the impact of European diseases on indigenous populations was profound and far-reaching. The introduction of diseases such as smallpox, influenza, and measles led to widespread mortality, social upheaval, and cultural disruption among indigenous societies. These epidemics played a critical role in shaping the demographic and social landscape of the Americas, influencing the course of European colonization and leaving a lasting legacy in the history of the New World. Cultural and technological exchanges. The Columbian Exchange was not limited to the transfer of biological materials and diseases. It also encompassed a rich array of cultural and technological exchanges between the Old World and the New World. These exchanges had significant and multifaceted impacts on both European and indigenous societies, reshaping cultural practices, technological capabilities, and daily life in profound ways. Technological transfers. One of the key aspects of the Columbian Exchange was the introduction and adaptation of various technologies. European explorers brought with them a range of technologies that had a considerable impact on indigenous societies. These included advanced metal tools and weapons, firearms, and navigational instruments. Metal tools, such as iron and steel knives, plows, and axes, were introduced to indigenous peoples who had previously used tools made from stone, bone, or wood. The availability of these new tools significantly improved agricultural and construction practices, enabling more efficient farming and building techniques. However, these technologies also had the potential to disrupt traditional methods and create new dependencies on European goods. Firearms, including muskets and cannons, were another technological transfer that had a profound impact. The introduction of gunpowder weapons altered the balance of power in many regions. Indigenous groups who gained access to firearms could leverage them in conflicts, while those who did not faced significant disadvantages. This technological disparity often led to shifts in regional power dynamics and influenced the outcomes of conflicts between indigenous groups and European settlers. Navigational instruments, such as the astrolabe and the compass, were crucial for European explorers as they ventured into uncharted territories. These tools allowed for more precise navigation and contributed to the successful exploration and mapping of new lands. Indigenous peoples who encountered these technologies often adapted them for their own use, integrating new navigational techniques into their own practices. Cultural exchanges. The Columbian Exchange also facilitated significant cultural exchanges. European settlers brought with them their languages, religions, customs, and artistic traditions, which began to blend with indigenous cultures. This cultural amalgamation resulted in the development of new cultural forms and practices. The introduction of European religions, particularly Christianity, had a profound impact on indigenous belief systems. Missionaries established missions and sought to convert indigenous peoples, often leading to the integration of Christian practices with traditional spiritual beliefs. This syncretism resulted in the creation of unique religious practices that combined elements of both European and indigenous traditions. European languages also began to influence indigenous languages, with many indigenous communities incorporating European words and concepts into their own languages. This linguistic exchange was a reflection of the broader cultural interactions taking place. In terms of culinary culture, the exchange of foodstuffs had a significant impact on diets on both sides of the Atlantic. European settlers adopted indigenous crops such as maize and potatoes, which became staples in European diets. Conversely, indigenous peoples began to incorporate European foods into their diets, leading to new culinary practices and food combinations. Impact on indigenous societies. The technological and cultural exchanges had complex effects on indigenous societies. On one hand, the introduction of new tools and practices often provided benefits and enhanced the capabilities of indigenous communities. For example, the adoption of European agricultural techniques and tools could lead to increased productivity and improved living standards. On the other hand, these exchanges also led to disruptions and challenges. The rapid influx of European goods and technologies sometimes led to dependency and the undermining of traditional practices. The spread of European cultural norms and religious practices often resulted in the erosion of indigenous cultures and social structures. Long-term implications. The long-term implications of these exchanges were profound and enduring. The blending of European and indigenous cultures resulted in the creation of new cultural forms and identities that continue to shape the Americas today. The exchange of technologies influenced economic and social developments, contributing to the transformation of societies on both sides of the Atlantic. The impact of cultural and technological exchanges highlights the complexity of the Columbian Exchange and its far-reaching effects. The interactions between European and indigenous peoples during this period were characterized by both cooperation and conflict, leading to a dynamic and multifaceted legacy. In summary, the Columbian Exchange facilitated significant cultural and technological exchanges that reshaped societies on both sides of the Atlantic. The introduction of new technologies and cultural practices had profound impacts on indigenous communities and European settlers alike, leading to both opportunities and challenges. Understanding these exchanges provides valuable insights into the transformative effects of the Age of Discovery and the complex interplay between exploration, culture, and technology. Early colonization efforts. The early attempts at colonization in the Americas represent a pivotal chapter in world history, marked by European nations seeking to establish permanent footholds in newly discovered lands. This period of colonization was characterized by a range of strategies, motivations, and outcomes, with Spain emerging as a dominant force through its aggressive expansion in the New World. The complexities of these early colonization efforts reveal much about the interaction between European ambitions and indigenous realities. Motivations for colonization. European colonization of the Americas was driven by a combination of economic, strategic, and religious motivations. For Spain, the primary drive was the pursuit of wealth and power. The discovery of vast resources, including gold, silver, and fertile lands, presented an opportunity for unprecedented economic gain. Spain aimed to exploit these resources to enhance its global standing and assert dominance over rival European powers. In addition to economic motivations, Spain was also motivated by a strategic desire to expand its influence and establish control over newly discovered territories. The establishment of colonies was seen as a way to secure and protect valuable trade routes and resources. Spanish explorers and conquistadors sought to claim territories before other European powers could establish their own claims. Religious zeal was another significant motivation. The Spanish crown, heavily influenced by Catholicism, sought to convert indigenous populations to Christianity. The mission to spread Christianity was often intertwined with colonial ambitions, leading to the establishment of missions and churches alongside settlements. Spanish conquest and colonization. Spain's approach to colonization was notably aggressive and expansive. The Spanish crown authorized expeditions and conquests led by figures known as conquistadors. These individuals were granted licenses by the crown to explore, conquer, and claim territories on behalf of Spain. The actions of the conquistadors were pivotal in establishing Spanish dominance in the Americas. Hernán Cortés is one of the most famous of these conquistadors. In 1519, Cortés embarked on an expedition that would lead to the fall of the Aztec Empire. With a relatively small force, Cortés leveraged alliances with rival indigenous groups and utilized advanced weaponry to overcome the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. The conquest of the Aztecs was marked by both military prowess and the exploitation of internal divisions within the empire. The fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521 led to the establishment of New Spain, with Mexico City becoming the new capital. Similarly, Francisco Pizarro led the expedition that resulted in the conquest of the Inca Empire. In 1532, Pizarro captured the Inca ruler Atahualpa and, through a combination of military force and manipulation, subdued the Inca capital of Cuzco. The conquest of the Incas led to the establishment of the Viceroyalty of Peru, which became a major center of Spanish colonial administration and economic activity. Challenges and strategies. The early efforts of colonization faced numerous challenges. One of the primary challenges was the need to establish and maintain control over vast and often unfamiliar territories. Spanish colonists had to contend with unfamiliar climates, landscapes, and the complexities of governing diverse and often resistant indigenous populations. To address these challenges, Spain implemented various strategies to consolidate its control. The Spanish crown established a system of viceroyalties, with viceroys appointed to oversee large regions and manage colonial affairs. This system allowed for more effective administration and control over colonial territories. Additionally, Spain utilized a range of administrative and economic mechanisms to support colonization efforts. The encomienda system, for example, was a system of labor and tribute that granted Spanish settlers the right to extract labor and resources from indigenous communities. While intended to provide settlers with labor and support, the encomienda system often led to the exploitation and mistreatment of indigenous peoples. Spain also established missions and religious institutions to support colonization. Missions were intended to convert indigenous populations to Christianity and integrate them into Spanish colonial society. These missions played a dual role, serving both religious and administrative functions. Impact on indigenous populations. The early colonization efforts had profound and often devastating impacts on indigenous populations. The arrival of Europeans brought significant changes to indigenous societies, including disruptions to social structures, displacement from traditional lands, and exposure to new diseases. The imposition of European political, economic, and religious systems often led to the erosion of indigenous cultures and ways of life. The Spanish colonization efforts led to the widespread exploitation and displacement of indigenous peoples. The introduction of European diseases, combined with warfare and forced labor, resulted in dramatic population declines and social upheaval. Indigenous communities faced the loss of traditional lands, cultural practices, and autonomy. The Spanish approach to colonization was characterized by both conquest and assimilation. While some indigenous groups resisted and fought against Spanish rule, others were incorporated into the colonial system through alliances, conversion, and adaptation. The blending of Spanish and indigenous cultures led to the development of new cultural forms, but often at the expense of traditional indigenous practices and identities. Legacy of early colonization. The legacy of early colonization is complex and multifaceted. On one hand, Spanish colonization established a framework for the development of colonial societies and economies in the Americas. The introduction of new crops, technologies, and administrative systems had lasting effects on the region's development. On the other hand, the impacts on indigenous populations were profound and often detrimental. The legacy of colonization includes the enduring consequences of disease, displacement, and cultural disruption. The history of Spanish colonization is marked by both achievements and tragedies, reflecting the complex interplay of ambition, exploitation, and cultural exchange. In summary, early colonization efforts by Spain were driven by economic, strategic, and religious motivations. The actions of conquistadors and settlers played a crucial role in establishing Spanish dominance in the Americas, but these efforts came with significant challenges and profound impacts on indigenous populations. The legacy of early colonization is a testament to the transformative and often disruptive nature of European expansion in the New World. The role of indigenous alliances and resistance. The early colonization of the Americas was shaped not only by European ambitions and strategies, but also by the dynamic responses of indigenous peoples. Indigenous groups played a crucial role in shaping the course of European expansion through both alliances and resistance. Their actions, strategies, and adaptations significantly influenced the outcomes of early colonization efforts and left a lasting impact on the history of the Americas. Indigenous alliances with Europeans. One of the notable aspects of early colonization was the formation of alliances between European explorers and indigenous groups. These alliances were often strategic, driven by mutual interests or necessities, and had a significant impact on the dynamics of colonization. For example, Hernán Cortés's conquest of the Aztec Empire was significantly aided by his alliances with rival indigenous groups. The Tlaxcalans, one of the principal enemies of the Aztecs, allied with Cortés against the Aztec Empire. This alliance provided Cortés with additional military support, local knowledge, and resources that were crucial in overcoming the Aztec forces. The alliance between Cortés and the Tlaxcalans highlights how indigenous groups navigated their own political and social landscapes in response to European incursions. Similarly, Francisco Pizarro's conquest of the Inca Empire involved alliances with indigenous factions within the empire. Pizarro exploited existing internal conflicts and rivalries among the Inca to facilitate his conquest. The assistance of indigenous allies allowed Pizarro to gain a foothold in the Inca capital of Cuzco and ultimately establish control over the empire. Forms of indigenous resistance. Indigenous resistance to European colonization took many forms, ranging from armed conflict to nonviolent forms of resistance. The resistance efforts varied depending on the region, the nature of European encroachment, and the specific circumstances faced by indigenous groups. Armed resistance was a prominent form of opposition. Indigenous peoples across the Americas engaged in numerous armed conflicts with European colonizers. In North America, various tribes and confederacies, such as the Powhatan Confederacy in Virginia and the Pueblo Revolt in the Southwest, mounted significant resistance against English and Spanish settlers. These conflicts often involved sophisticated military strategies and tactics adapted to the local terrain and circumstances. One of the most notable examples of resistance was the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 in present-day New Mexico. The Pueblo people, led by the leader Pope, successfully rebelled against Spanish colonial rule. The revolt was driven by grievances related to religious oppression, forced labor, and land encroachment. The Pueblo's coordinated efforts led to a temporary expulsion of the Spanish from the region and marked a significant moment of indigenous resistance. In South America, indigenous resistance was also prominent. The Mapuche people in Chile fought against Spanish attempts to conquer their territory throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. Their resistance involved a series of prolonged and often fierce conflicts with Spanish forces. The Mapuche were able to maintain their independence and resist Spanish colonization for an extended period, highlighting their resilience and strategic capabilities. Adaptations and negotiations. In addition to armed resistance, many indigenous groups engaged in negotiations and adaptations to cope with European encroachment. These interactions often involved complex negotiations over land, trade, and political alliances. Some indigenous groups chose to negotiate treaties or agreements with European powers in an effort to protect their territories or gain concessions. These agreements were sometimes temporary and subject to change as power dynamics shifted. The Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, between Spain and Portugal, for example, aimed to divide the newly discovered lands between the two powers. While this treaty primarily addressed European interests, indigenous groups were directly affected by its outcomes. Indigenous peoples also adapted to European influences by incorporating new technologies, goods, and practices into their own cultures. The adoption of European firearms, for instance, allowed some indigenous groups to enhance their military capabilities and negotiate from a position of strength. Similarly, the introduction of European crops and agricultural techniques could lead to changes in traditional practices and food systems. Impact of indigenous responses. The responses of indigenous peoples had a significant impact on the course of European colonization. Indigenous resistance and alliances influenced the success and limitations of European expansion efforts. The need to navigate complex indigenous political landscapes and manage resistance shaped colonial strategies and policies. European colonizers often had to adapt their approaches in response to indigenous resistance and negotiation. The persistence of indigenous resistance and the ability of some groups to maintain their autonomy demonstrated the resilience and agency of indigenous peoples in the face of colonization. Legacy of indigenous alliances and resistance. The legacy of indigenous alliances and resistance is an integral part of the history of early colonization. These responses highlight the agency and resilience of indigenous peoples in shaping the outcomes of European expansion. The alliances formed with Europeans, as well as the various forms of resistance, underscore the complexities of early encounters and the ways in which indigenous groups navigated the challenges posed by colonization. The impact of indigenous responses continues to be a significant aspect of historical analysis and understanding. Recognizing the role of indigenous peoples in the history of colonization provides a more nuanced and comprehensive view of the past, acknowledging their contributions, struggles, and agency in shaping the course of history. In summary, the role of indigenous alliances and resistance in early colonization efforts was crucial in shaping the outcomes of European expansion. Indigenous responses, including alliances, armed resistance, and adaptations, influenced colonial strategies and highlighted the agency and resilience of indigenous peoples. Understanding these dynamics provides valuable insights into the complexities of early encounters and the enduring legacy of indigenous responses to colonization. Economic impacts of early colonization. The economic impacts of early colonization in the Americas were profound and far-reaching, reshaping global trade patterns, altering local economies, and establishing new economic systems. The establishment of European colonies brought about significant changes in both the Old World and the New World, driven by the pursuit of wealth, resource exploitation, and the development of new economic structures. Extraction of resources and wealth. One of the primary economic motivations behind early colonization was the extraction of valuable resources. The discovery of precious metals, such as gold and silver, was a major driver of European expansion in the Americas. The Spanish, in particular, were heavily invested in mining operations in their colonies. In the Spanish colonies, the search for gold and silver led to the establishment of extensive mining operations. The discovery of vast silver deposits in Potosí, in present-day Bolivia, and Zacatecas, in present-day Mexico, had a transformative impact on both the Spanish Empire and the global economy. The influx of silver from the Americas contributed to Spain's wealth and enabled it to become a dominant European power during the 16th and 17th centuries. However, this wealth also led to inflation and economic instability in Spain, as the sudden increase in precious metals contributed to rising prices. The exploitation of indigenous labor was a significant aspect of the resource extraction process. The encomienda system, which granted Spanish settlers the right to extract labor and tribute from indigenous communities, played a crucial role in supporting mining operations. This system often led to the harsh treatment and exploitation of indigenous workers, with severe consequences for their health and well-being. Agricultural and commercial development. In addition to resource extraction, early colonization efforts focused on the development of agriculture and commercial enterprises. The Spanish and other European powers sought to establish agricultural colonies that could produce valuable crops and goods for export. The introduction of European crops and farming techniques significantly altered the agricultural landscape of the Americas. European settlers established plantations and farms to grow crops such as sugarcane, tobacco, and coffee. The cultivation of these crops became a major economic activity, with plantations often relying on the labor of enslaved Africans who were forcibly brought to the Americas as part of the transatlantic slave trade. The sugarcane plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil, for example, became central to the colonial economies. Sugar production required large amounts of labor and capital investment, leading to the establishment of a plantation economy that had a profound impact on the social and economic structures of the colonies. Similarly, tobacco cultivation in Virginia and other English colonies became a major economic driver, contributing to the growth of the Atlantic economy. Trade and commerce. The early colonial period also saw the development of extensive trade networks that connected the Americas with Europe, Africa, and Asia. The transatlantic trade routes became a crucial component of the global economy, facilitating the exchange of goods, people, and resources. The establishment of colonial ports and trade centers allowed for the export of colonial goods to European markets. European powers established monopolies and trading companies to manage and control trade with their colonies. For instance, the Dutch West India Company and the British East India Company played significant roles in managing colonial trade and establishing commercial networks. The exchange of goods between the Americas and Europe included not only precious metals and agricultural products but also new commodities and luxuries. European markets saw the introduction of American products such as potatoes, tomatoes, and chocolate, which became integrated into European diets and cultures. Similarly, European goods, including textiles and manufactured items, were introduced to the Americas, influencing local economies and consumption patterns. Impact on indigenous economies. The economic impacts of early colonization extended to indigenous economies, often with disruptive and detrimental effects. The introduction of European trade goods and economic systems altered traditional indigenous economies and social structures. The imposition of European economic practices and systems, such as the encomienda system and plantation agriculture, had significant effects on indigenous communities. Indigenous labor was exploited for the benefit of European settlers, leading to economic disruption and social upheaval. The forced integration of indigenous peoples into colonial economic systems often undermined traditional economic practices and contributed to the erosion of indigenous economic autonomy. Long-term economic effects. The long-term economic effects of early colonization had lasting implications for both Europe and the Americas. The wealth generated from resource extraction and trade contributed to the rise of European colonial empires and the expansion of global trade networks. The influx of precious metals and the development of colonial economies played a significant role in shaping the modern global economy. In the Americas, the establishment of colonial economies laid the groundwork for future economic developments and conflicts. The legacy of colonial economic practices, including resource exploitation and labor systems, continued to influence economic and social structures in the post-colonial period. Conclusion. In summary, the economic impacts of early colonization were profound and transformative, reshaping global trade patterns, local economies, and social structures. The pursuit of wealth through resource extraction, agricultural development, and trade drove European expansion and had significant consequences for both the Old World and the New World. The exploitation of resources and labor, the development of colonial economies, and the establishment of global trade networks all played crucial roles in shaping the economic landscape of the early modern period. Understanding these economic impacts provides valuable insights into the broader effects of colonization and its enduring legacy in the global economy. Social and cultural transformations. The early colonization of the Americas triggered profound social and cultural transformations that reshaped societies on both sides of the Atlantic. The interactions between European settlers and indigenous peoples led to significant changes in social structures, cultural practices, and identities. These transformations were driven by a combination of cultural exchanges, imposed systems, and the blending of diverse traditions. Cultural exchange and syncretism. One of the most notable aspects of early colonization was the exchange of cultural practices between Europeans and indigenous peoples. This exchange resulted in a rich tapestry of cultural syncretism, where elements from both European and indigenous cultures merged to create new forms of expression and identity. Religious syncretism. Religious syncretism was a significant outcome of early colonization. European missionaries sought to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity, often adapting their religious practices to incorporate elements of indigenous beliefs. This blending of religious traditions led to the development of unique forms of worship that combined Christian doctrines with indigenous spiritual practices. In Latin America, for example, the Virgin of Guadalupe became a central figure in religious syncretism. She is venerated as an indigenous representation of the Virgin Mary, symbolizing the fusion of Catholicism with Aztec religious traditions. This syncretism reflected the complex interactions between Spanish missionaries and indigenous peoples, leading to the creation of hybrid religious practices that resonated with both communities. Cultural exchange in arts and cuisine. The exchange of cultural practices extended to the arts and cuisine. European settlers introduced new artistic styles, techniques, and materials, which indigenous artists incorporated into their own traditions. This cultural exchange resulted in the creation of new artistic forms that reflected a blend of European and indigenous influences. In terms of cuisine, the Columbian exchange introduced new ingredients and cooking techniques to both sides of the Atlantic. Indigenous foods such as maize, potatoes, and tomatoes became staples in European diets, while European ingredients and cooking methods were adopted by indigenous communities. This blending of culinary traditions led to the development of new dishes and food practices that became integral to both European and indigenous cultures. Social hierarchies and class structures. The establishment of European colonies introduced new social hierarchies and class structures that had profound effects on indigenous societies. European colonizers imposed their own social systems, which often disrupted traditional indigenous social structures and created new class dynamics. Colonial social hierarchies. European colonial societies were characterized by rigid social hierarchies that privileged Europeans and marginalized indigenous peoples. In Spanish colonies, for example, a complex caste system was established that classified individuals based on their ethnicity and place of origin. At the top of the hierarchy were the Spanish-born colonists, peninsulars, followed by those born in the colonies of Spanish descent, criollos, and then mestizos, mixed-race individuals, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans. This caste system created significant social and economic disparities. Europeans and their descendants held the most power and privilege, while indigenous peoples and Africans were often subjected to exploitation and discrimination. The imposition of European social structures led to the marginalization of indigenous cultures and the disruption of traditional social systems. Impact on indigenous social structures. The arrival of Europeans and the establishment of colonial rule had significant impacts on indigenous social structures. Traditional leadership systems were often undermined or replaced by European authorities. Indigenous communities were subjected to new forms of governance and administration that disrupted their traditional ways of organizing and governing themselves. In many cases, the introduction of European legal systems and land tenure practices led to the displacement of indigenous communities from their ancestral lands. This displacement had far-reaching consequences for indigenous social structures, as communities were often forced to relocate, adapt to new environments, and contend with the loss of traditional lands and resources. Education and language. The introduction of European colonial rule also had a significant impact on education and language in the Americas. European settlers established schools and institutions to promote European cultural and religious values. Missionaries played a key role in education, often teaching indigenous peoples European languages and religious doctrines. The imposition of European languages and educational systems led to changes in indigenous languages and literacy practices. Indigenous languages were often marginalized or suppressed in favor of European languages, resulting in the loss of linguistic diversity and the erosion of traditional knowledge. Cultural legacy and continuity. Despite the profound changes brought about by colonization, indigenous cultures and traditions persisted and adapted in various ways. Indigenous peoples maintained and adapted their cultural practices, identities, and traditions in response to the challenges posed by European colonization. The resilience of indigenous cultures is evident in the continued practice of traditional ceremonies, the preservation of languages, and the adaptation of cultural practices to new contexts. Indigenous communities have also worked to reclaim and revitalize their cultural heritage, ensuring the continuation of their traditions and identities. Conclusion. In summary, the social and cultural transformations resulting from early colonization were multifaceted and far-reaching. The blending of European and indigenous cultures led to the creation of new forms of expression, while the imposition of European social hierarchies disrupted traditional indigenous social structures. Despite these changes, Indigenous cultures demonstrated resilience and adaptability, maintaining and revitalizing their traditions in the face of colonization. Understanding these transformations provides valuable insights into the complex interplay of cultures and the enduring legacy of early colonization in shaping the social and cultural landscapes of the Americas. Long-term implications and historical legacy. The early colonization of the Americas set in motion a series of developments and transformations that have had lasting implications for global history. The interactions between European powers and indigenous peoples, the establishment of colonial societies, and the resulting economic, social, and cultural changes have left an indelible mark on the world. Understanding the long-term implications and historical legacy of early colonization provides crucial insights into the formation of modern global dynamics. Impact on indigenous populations. The long-term impact of early colonization on indigenous populations was profound and often devastating. The arrival of Europeans brought about widespread displacement, demographic collapse, and cultural disruption for indigenous peoples. The introduction of diseases, such as smallpox and influenza, led to catastrophic population declines in many indigenous communities. The loss of life and the disruption of social structures had lasting effects on indigenous societies. The imposition of European political, economic, and religious systems further eroded traditional indigenous ways of life. Indigenous peoples were often forced to adapt to new governance structures, economic practices, and cultural norms imposed by colonizers. The legacy of these changes is evident in the continued struggles of indigenous communities to reclaim and preserve their cultural heritage and autonomy. Formation of colonial economies. The establishment of colonial economies had lasting implications for global trade and economic development. The exploitation of resources, such as precious metals and agricultural products, fueled the growth of European colonial empires and contributed to the development of global trade networks. The wealth generated from colonial enterprises reshaped global economic patterns and influenced the rise of European powers. The development of plantation economies in the Americas, particularly in the Caribbean and Brazil, had significant effects on global trade and labor systems. The reliance on enslaved African labor in the plantations became a cornerstone of the transatlantic slave trade and contributed to the economic prosperity of European colonial powers. The legacy of this economic system has had enduring effects on global economic structures and social inequalities. Cultural exchange and hybrid identities. The cultural exchanges initiated by early colonization have had a lasting impact on the cultural landscapes of the Americas and beyond. The blending of European and indigenous cultures resulted in the creation of new forms of expression, identity, and cultural practices. This syncretism is evident in various aspects of culture, including religion, art, cuisine, and language. The emergence of hybrid cultural identities reflects the complex interactions between European settlers and indigenous peoples. The fusion of cultural elements has contributed to the rich and diverse cultural heritage of the Americas. However, this cultural blending also involved the suppression and marginalization of indigenous traditions and practices, highlighting the complexities of cultural interactions during the colonial period. Geopolitical changes. The early colonization of the Americas had significant geopolitical implications that continue to influence global politics and relations. The establishment of European colonies in the New World led to shifts in global power dynamics and competition among European powers. The quest for territorial expansion and control over colonial resources shaped international relations and colonial rivalries. The legacy of early colonization is also reflected in the geopolitical landscape of the Americas today. The borders and political structures established during the colonial period have had lasting effects on the development of nations and regions. The historical legacy of colonialism continues to shape political and economic relations between countries and influence contemporary issues such as land rights, sovereignty, and cultural identity. Indigenous resistance and resilience. The history of early colonization is also marked by the resilience and resistance of indigenous peoples. Despite the challenges and disruptions caused by colonization, indigenous communities have demonstrated remarkable resilience in preserving their cultural heritage and advocating for their rights. The ongoing efforts to revitalize indigenous languages, traditions, and governance systems reflect the enduring strength and agency of indigenous peoples. Indigenous resistance movements and cultural revival initiatives have played a crucial role in challenging historical injustices and seeking reparative justice. The recognition of indigenous rights and the promotion of cultural preservation are essential components of addressing the historical legacy of colonization and fostering reconciliation. Historical memory and interpretation. The historical legacy of early colonization is subject to ongoing debate and interpretation. Different perspectives on colonization, including those from indigenous, colonial, and post-colonial viewpoints, contribute to a multifaceted understanding of the past. The interpretation of historical events and their implications is shaped by evolving narratives and the inclusion of diverse voices. The process of historical memory involves revisiting and reassessing the impact of colonization, acknowledging the complexities of historical interactions, and striving for a more inclusive and accurate representation of the past. This process contributes to a deeper understanding of the legacy of colonization and its relevance to contemporary issues. Conclusion. In summary, the long-term implications and historical legacy of early colonization are profound and multifaceted. The impact on indigenous populations, the formation of colonial economies, the blending of cultures, and the geopolitical changes all reflect the enduring effects of early colonization. The resilience and resistance of indigenous peoples, as well as the ongoing process of historical interpretation, highlight the complexity of the colonial legacy. Understanding these aspects provides valuable insights into the formation of modern global dynamics and the continued relevance of historical events in shaping contemporary issues.